What was the most awkward thing you witnessed in a school classroom? Story 1. My professor for a computer science class has his phone go off during a lecture one day. He's a pretty chill old man, so everyone starts giggling and some people are yelling at him to answer it. He looks at his phone and says, "Oh no, I'm not answering. My brother died today and I have to make funeral arrangements. I'll call back later." And then he moved on with his lecture. I've never seen a room so awkwardly quiet and sad. Story 2. We had one of those strange or quiet kids at school that everyone would verbally abuse. One day, he showed up with 4 long scratch marks on the side of his face. These were pretty raw and were scabbing up. Kids were making fun of him. "Hey, have a rough date last night? Hey, you're supposed to jack off your dick, not your head." This went on for a couple of days. Then we find out the kid had taken a butcher knife to his piano teacher during a lesson and chopped the hell out of her. They found her body on the floor of the kitchen, nude, mutilated, and a bottle of wine and 2 wine glasses on the counter. He came to school for 2 days afterwards while she laid there on the floor rotting. She had been sexually abusing him for weeks and he finally snapped. Poor kid. He got off on self-defense, and he and his family went underground after that, name change and everything. Story 3. Middle school chemistry class. The ceiling vent fan had not been used since at least the previous spring term. Pigeons had nested in it unbeknownst to the teacher. Fan used during a demonstration. Pandemonium reigned that day. Blood and feathers reigned that day. Story 4. So part of my job at the time had me meeting with teachers and schools to discuss alternative programs for students. One of the teachers had been working there for 20 plus years. She had job security and would tell exactly what she thought. It leads to some awkward exchanges when discussing students. Things like, "Oh, he's crazier than a shithouse rat. You don't want him in the place without heavy security." The most awkward, however, was when she said, "She really gets around for a girl with one arm. Like a slot machine that pays out in BJ's. Story 5. In high school, I reached down for a binder that was in my backpack on the floor. I reached down to grab it, and then I positioned myself back upright in my chair. I ended up scooping the teacher's boobs, who was walking down the aisle, with my head. We just kind of looked at each other in fear, and no words came out of either of our mouths. Nobody else saw it, or at least made a point to say that they saw it. I like to think it was just our little uncomfortable secret. Story 6. I was in the 9th grade, and there was a girl in my classroom who broke both of her arms. So she had them in the cast that held her arms above her waist. Now this girl wasn't the most popular, and she was friends with another girl who was equally awkward as she was. I will never forget when my best friend raised her hand to get the attention of the teacher. The teacher called on her best friend, and she asked if she and her broken-armed friend could use the restroom together. And the teacher asks, "Why would you need to go together?" She replies just like this, "I have to unzip and take off her pants." Looking back, I understand that she just wanted to help her friend use the restroom, but imagine being in 9th grade and you hear this. Everyone in the classroom was silent. Then one kid started laughing. Then everyone started laughing. And that is how the lesbian rumor started about the two. What a good friend, though. Sucks she was just trying to be nice, but ended up making both of their lives worse. Story 7. A friend of mine was bragging about how he could sleep with any of the girls in the class. My other friend decided to put his boast to the test by asking all girls at once, loudly. The one guy that slept through every class raised his hand. Story 8. I used to substitute teach after college. A quick realization that I wasn't cut out for elementary-aged children, or kids in general, happened one day while subbing for a kindergarten class. After lunch, the kids are crazy with energy. I see one boy tugging on another boy's arm in a romantic way, trying to pull the boy under a table. I approach to separate the two, when I turn around and see 2 boys exposing themselves to a little girl underneath a table across the room. I freak out and scream, "Whoa, stop! Everybody stop!" Silence in the room. Except for the arm tugger boy who is now climbing on top of his buddy he pulled underneath a table and is caressing the face of said victim. I called the principal down to deal with everything, and the little girl urinated herself from her desk out of fear of the principal and counselors being in the room. This was my last day ever substitute teaching. Story 9. 11th grade. Shizzy alternative school. One of the scummy kids was a notorious cigarette bum. They gave us smoke breaks at school to cut down on kids leaving campus. One day, he asked for a cigarette from someone, and they said, "Eat a dead fly off the windowsill and I'll give you a cigarette." He thought about it for a minute, and someone else offered to give him a cigarette for every fly he ate. This turned into eating all 24 of the available dead flies for 24 cigarettes. He ate them one at a time, and collected a cigarette for each. The next day, he tried again, but there weren't any flies to eat. The following day, he brought his own flies in. That kid was effed up. He's like an entrepreneur. Story 10. In 7th grade, there was this girl who was known for doing all kinds of weird stuff. She cut a chunk of her hair off and left it on my friend's desk as a birthday present, meowed at people, and cried when anyone stepped on a bug. The most awkward incident happened when she dropped her pencil during a test. I guess she was too shy to ask the person next to her for it, so she tried to stretch for it and ended up flipping her desk over. She then continued to do her test on her desk sideways for another 10 minutes until the teacher told another student to flip her over. This sounds like it could be in Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Story 11. In 2nd grade of high school, a student flipped the F out and started throwing chairs at his desk at the teacher because he was refused a test reprisal upon failing it the first time. Shiz got super scary. He was yelling like crazy, and the female teacher was trying to protect herself from the things thrown at her. Another teacher next door barged in, grabbed the enraged student, nailed him on the floor, face down, and tied his feet and arms together with his belt and shoelace. I remember him being taken away, and we never saw him again. I think the teachers ate him. Story 12. There was this couple in my math class who had broken up. The guy sat behind the girl for the rest of the year. One day, John goes to the washroom, and while he is out, some guy who sits close to him opens his bag and quietly starts pulling out its contents and very quietly places them on his desk. There's the usual things. Then there's a bottle of hand lotion, some 8x10 glossies of his ex, some other pictures of her. Those get piled on the desk too. John returns, sees the items on the desk, and loses his mind. Starts swearing. Now everyone is looking over, including his ex, who says, "What the F? I thought you said you gave all those back." Everyone sees what she's talking about. It was very uncomfortable. Story 13. As a senior in high school government class, my teacher would hit on all the girls in the class. One day he asked one of the girls if she was spanked for bad behavior as a child, and when she said that she had, he quietly asked her if she liked it, while the rest of the class was there. Half the room heard. That teacher is super creepy. Report that teacher. Story 14. When I was in elementary school, there was a girl in my class who wanted to go to the bathroom. The teacher repeatedly refused her request, and she finally shiz herself. The teacher ushered her to the bathroom and put the turd in a plastic bag and held it in front of the class while the girl stood there next to her, humiliated. Pretty sure she called the girl's parents to pick her up after that. The girl just sat in her desk with her head down until they arrived. Story 15. This mentally handicapped kid in my class named Mark was always super infatuated with this really smart, nice girl in our class. He would always talk about how he was going to make her his girlfriend, and she was always just too nice to him to tell him it wasn't going to happen. This went on for years. Anyway, one day someone thought it would be funny to tell Mark I was dating the love of his life. I wasn't. Mark flipped his shiz and found me in the hallway and pushed me up against this gigantic topographical plaster map of Alberta. The Rocky Mountains cut into my back as he pushed me harder into it and yelled into my face while crying about how Tessa was his girlfriend and I needed to leave her alone. I told him I wasn't dating her and he ran off crying. Poor guy. Story 16. I was in 8th grade, and I was usually sitting in the middle of the class. But it was starting to get boring, and I moved to the back of the class with a kid who was always joking and not paying attention to class. Our math teacher was pretty feared by all students, and everyone was paying attention to our classes. That day, we didn't pay attention to anything. We were just playing tic-tac-toe instead of taking notes. As the games got more competitive and we focused more on the game, the teacher saw us. She and the whole class were looking at us for about 2 to 3 minutes without saying anything. Out of nowhere, I hear someone saying, "Everybody stop because the two guys at the back of the class are very focused on their lesson." The whole class started laughing and I was moved to the front of the class that day. Story 17. Back in the 6th grade, I had a kid who always caused trouble and tried to be the center of attention all the time. Welp, this kid had a weird way of flirting with girls, whether it would be shooting spitballs at them or pour water on them. One day he told all his friends he would literally poop his pants during class in order to show off to girls. During class, you were giggling, and it began to smell. Everyone looks at him because he was sitting in the back of the class, and he stands up while laughing and says, "Teacher, I need to go to the bathroom. I accidentally shiz my pants." With shiz running down his legs, he walks out of the class laughing hysterically as if he had won a Nobel Prize or something. By the way, he was never popular with the girls. Story 18. Freshman year of high school, circa 1990. We had a new history teacher fresh out of college, and he quickly gained a reputation for being a pushover. He was also notorious for never looking at the class. If this guy was reading to us from the book, we might as well have all been smoking meth or something for all he knew. My class decided to do a cattle drive, where we would all slowly scoot our desks toward him. Being the deviants that we were, we chose the day he was being evaluated by the principal to do this. It didn't take long before we were literally at his feet. Some of the students even went past him and had their desks against the chalkboard. He never looked up from that book. The principal was not amused. She took him out in the hallway and chewed him out so loud the entire school heard. He came back into the classroom, looked at the carnage we had created, loosened his tie, and laughed. Then he sat down at his desk and smoked a cigarette. He was fired at the end of the year. Story 19. In 9th grade, we were watching a film. The lights were out and we were watching a film about our founding fathers. I am sitting at the back of the classroom and on my left is an odd fellow we had in our class. I started hearing shuffling and slight humph noises and took a look and saw this kid's bare wiener and him going to town. I was in shock, didn't know how to react, so I continued to watch the film. That's when I discovered Thomas Jefferson was multilingual. Kid never got caught. I was too scared to say anything. Story 20. I remember a substitute teacher that we had for a few days when I was in middle school. She was pretty overweight, and one day she grabbed a chair from an empty desk to help someone out with their assignment, when suddenly we heard a loud crash. One of the legs of the chair had broken, and she was flat on her back. It was hard not to laugh, but what made it even worse is as she was getting up, she ended up farting very loudly. The entire class erupted into a fit of laughter, and she had to leave the classroom because she was so embarrassed. Story 21. My friends and I used to play this game that when someone said, "That's what she said," everyone had to say a color. The last person to say a color, or someone who said the same color someone else already said, they have to moan then and there. Our Spanish teacher became aware of this game because we played it several times during class. Well, it happens, and everyone argues about who had to moan. No one could figure out who was last, so everyone argues. I say, whatever, I'll do it, and moan the loudest high-pitched female moan I could muster, causing everyone to burst out laughing, and my Spanish teacher to blush and say that was enough of that game in her class. Story 22. Stuck in the gym after the school went on lockdown because of planned student walkouts over immigration protests in Los Angeles. Anyway, there was this kid who was really into Naruto. Stocky, ginger, terrible acne, and always playing his hands like he was doing Naruto spells at people. Needless to say, he was not the apex of the social hierarchy. This, however, didn't stop him from pairing up with a girl who was just as different as he was. So a few hours into lockdown, teachers started looking and counting kids to make sure no one went off the reservation, and when they started looking for Naruto boy, he is under the bleachers with the girl, squeezing each other's zits and eating whatever came out. Story 23. I took a weightlifting class in high school. My school was pretty great with including the special education kids in a variety of classes, this one included. Many of the kids, we'll call him Benny, was on the elliptical doing his thing until all of us smelled straight shiz coming from the cardio area. Turns out Benny pooped his pants, and it not only leaked out of his pants, it got all into the nooks and crannies of the machine. It was a lot, and he kept going. It was hard to not laugh at this, especially when someone yells from across the room, "Finish that mile, Benny!" Story 24. We would smoke pot before school in the morning. This new teacher started at the school who was very overweight and ugly, so we were naturally a-hole high school boys and made fun of her. She realized how stoned we were when we came to class, so she started bringing us all kinds of cakes and candy and snacks every time we had her. She turned out to be awesome and we were such pricks at first. She was just fattening you up, playing the long con, giving you bad eating habits at a young age with devil lettuce as an aid. Story 25. My friend in high school was a classic D&D nerd. Star Wars and pretty much Revenge of the Nerds poster boy. While walking the hall with him in between classes, he was looking at me while walking and he walked headfirst into a cheerleader, the hottest one in the school. She fell backward and grabbed him while on the way down, pulling him down with her. As he hit the ground, he was so embarrassed, confused that for some reason he thought the best thing to do was kiss her boo-boo, so he leaned over her as she clutched her forehead and kissed it. I cringed so hard that I nearly passed out. He just stood up, put his glasses back on as they had fallen off in the tumble, and walked away. Story 26. I'm a teacher and have many awkward stories. I begin class sometimes with questions the whole class responds to by standing for yes, staying seated for no. I try to stay young and in the know, but the older I get, the harder it is. so I had students write down questions on an index card that I could choose from to start class. A cold February morning. I'm starting class looking through the cards for interesting ones to ask. I read this question in my serious teacher's voice. Do you have your V card? The class goes crazy. I'm confused because I thought it meant Valentine's Day. A student set me straight on what V stood for, and I was embarrassed but also curious and asked, they give you a card now? It turns out, no, not at all. I'm just old and out of touch. Story 27. There was once a kid in my 10th grade history class who happened to be wearing a Gryffindor scarf that day. He continually checked the clock until about 3:05 p.m. Then he looked at the kid that sat in front of me, nodded and smiled, then proceeded to take his shirt off. He started running around the room, shirtless, waving his Harry Potter scarf, yelling, 10 points for Gryffindor! He did about 2 laps around the room while my teacher just watched. Then he ran out of the room. Story 28. When I was a sophomore in high school, I had geometry. The teacher was a notorious perv. He had just returned from a leave of absence because he walked in on a girl in the bathroom. Anyway, that day I was sitting in the front, and next to me was one of the cheerleaders. This was game day, so she was in uniform. She stretched her arm up and yawned, and as she did so, her nipples became visible. I guess the pervy teacher caught me looking because he looked at me and winked. As the bell rang, he blocked my path and said, Boy, those headlights sure were on this morning. Story 29. High school teacher thought a kid had a Pringles can in his pants. She told him to hand it over. They went through the I don't know what you're talking about thing until she finally grabbed what she thought was a Pringles can, but it turned out to be this kid's huge erection. And this kid had a gigantic D. It's a reasonable mistake on her part.